right, welcome everyone to our segment 1 2020 class in June. Today we're going to look at Mars Pluto full phase as we wind down Venus retrograde in Gemini. Then we get started for a Mercury retrograde in Cancer. If you did not attend the free Mercury retrograde webinar last night, you can find it on our website under the new and full moon audio podcasts, this first link that you see here on your screen. And you see everything else. I think it was last month's class when we were just celebrating having our YouTube channel back. So looks like we're in full swing with that. If any of you are wanting a compatibility session, I am taking Venus retrograde consultations up until Venus direct. We are booking into July, but you can still get in the loop if you find you want a compatibility with someone in your life. And so let's just go ahead and get started. Here is the cycle of phases and aspects that you see on your screen. Giving credits to Dane Rudier, who first brought this out in his book, The Lunation Cycle, which Jeffrey Green then took on, adopted, expanded, and I've been using this for the 35 years I've been studying evolutionary astrology. I still didn't look that up. I had my first reading with Jeffrey Wolf Green, June of 1985. 35 years ago was the first week of June. And by the way, I just finished doing a 9-hour online workshop with Canadian astrologers from Manitoba. And we looked at the cycle of phases and aspects. So I feel like I've really been getting the handle on this one recently. Once we get all the recordings converted, we will put it up on our website for purchase to the general public if you are interested in that. It turned out to be a really good workshop. My Pluto Virgo was happy with it. Some of you know what that means. Here's a listing of all of the 8 phases by their degrees if you want that little handy printout to look at it. And so we're going to jump right in. And first of all, recognize that life and us are always in a state of continuous change and evolution. And we know this through the very first archetype of the zodiac, Mars, with its rulership of Aries in the first house, which is a single archetype, the planet, the sign, the house. And this is where we instinctively act upon our desire nature to become, to always grow, evolve, etc. And so we look at that 0 to 360 degrees as a complete cycle of evolution, from birth, growth, bloom, decay, to death, and start all over again. And the basic foundation of chart interpretation is that every planet and point in space is in a phasal relationship to every planet or other point in space, such as the nodes ascend at midheaven. An aspect may or may not exist, but they always have that phasal relationship. And so if you're a beginner to interpreting aspects, you start with the phase first and get that foundation, and then you fill in detail with the aspect if there is one. We'll have a couple examples of that today. Here is the slide on determining aspects to planets. You always start with a slower moving planet. You move in a counterclockwise fashion. If I'm going too fast, for anybody new to astrology, I refer you back to our 2014 cycle of phases and aspects where we broke all of this down in a little slower detail. This is more continuing ed segment 1. In the last few years, I have changed from one of Jeffrey Green's original teachings and kind of shifted over to what Laura Nalbandian does after I heard this from her. I compare Sun to the outer planets. So inner planets, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, start with Sun, counterclockwise to the inner planet. When it's the Sun and outer planets, we start with the outer planet and compare the Sun. In the case here of Sun Saturn, we start with Saturn. We end up going all the way around the circle, and the Sun is balsamic phase to Saturn. It's 13 degrees away from having an exact conjunction. So looking on your screen here, Sun balsamic to Saturn, the way I practice it. You don't have to agree with me. You can choose for yourself through observation correlation what works best for you. In determining aspects to the nodal axis, you always start with the planet. And because the mean motion of the nodes is always retrograde, you take the nodes clockwise until you get to each of the nodes to see what their phasal relationship is or the aspect. And keep in mind, because you start with the planet and you go the opposite direction, you go clockwise, reversing through signs and aspects, those 8 phases are flipped. They are just the opposite of the natural 8 phases with planet to planet. The example here is Uranus. If you start with Uranus and you go through the inner circle, you make it just shy of halfway around, and that south node is making a gibbous opposition to Uranus. If you start with Uranus, you can follow the outer circle all the way around. You see that the north node is a balsamic conjunction to Uranus. The north node was 1817 degrees Gemini. The north node would be a new phase conjunction to Uranus. Again, not going into any more detail with these. I refer you to the segment 1 classes on cycle of phases and aspects basics. Because we are working with the phasal relationships between Mars and Pluto, just briefly, there are 4 ways in which Pluto affects evolution. 2 of them are non-cataclysmic, 2 are cataclysmic, and they can be blended. You see on your screen, non-cataclysmic, producing or creating a situation in which we form a relationship to something or someone that we perceive we need. You see example on your screen. We can also produce or create a situation in which we become aware of a new capacity or capability that has been latent or dormant within us. And this typically can, in a covert way, actually help us recognize reincarnation. I've given this example before. Astrology was extremely easy for me to learn. The astrology and the astronomy, because I've had experience past lives with doing this before. So it was something that was dormant within me until my early 20s, and then poof, took off with it. Cataclysmic, producing or creating emotional shocks in which some behavioral pattern or life situation can be removed from our life. Famous divorce, job loss, health emergency, and up to the ultimate removal, which is death of the body and the soul's departure from it. We can also produce or create situations in our lives in which we become aware of internal or external source of stagnation. And this is limiting our growth. And this will create crises in varying degrees. We can have the example here, the second one, of a divorce as well. In this case, we become aware of internal, external source. The external source, we become aware that the relationship no longer serves us. We tell partner, I want a divorce. I want a Y in the road. We're creating the shock for them. It's still a crisis for us, though, as well, moving on. 3 reactions to the evolutionary impulse. We can resist the karmic and evolutionary requirements altogether. This tends to be rare. We can go for it 100%, 200%, leave everything behind and just take off and move forward. That's also rare. The third reaction is most common, the areas where we're willing to change and the areas where we resist changing because of that fear of the unknown and the security we have built up with certain patterns in our life of how we are living it. I'm going to interrupt here. Leroy, would you turn the air conditioning on in this side of the house? I think we turned it off last night. It's 95 degrees outside, everybody. And I'm just realizing it's a little warm upstairs in my office. So thank you very much, Leroy. And so one of the Jeffrey Wolf Green teachings with Mars Pluto is the concept of primary and secondary lifetimes. And it is generally understood that it takes 8 to 9 primary lifetimes for a soul to work through whatever the lessons are for the karmic dynamic and the evolutionary intent of Pluto relative to a specific natal Pluto house. And these primary lifetimes are always one of the 8 45-degree aspects to each other. I have a tendency to allow up to 3 degrees applying and up to 5 degrees separating. It's not an absolute here. You can have a little bit closer orbs if you want. You can have 5 degrees applying. You can have 3 degrees separating. Whatever works for you and your observation correlation with whoever chart you're looking at. In between those primary lifetimes, Mars will be working through a specific phasal relationship with Pluto, and that's called the secondary lifetime. And there can be multiple secondary lifetimes working on those phasal lessons in a little bit more indirect fashion. In other words, what we are saying is a soul has free choice, free will to take as long as necessary to evolve or to go as fast as it desires relative to the soul's evolutionary journey. And so here are those primary lifetime examples. As you can see, this is more or less when Mars is one more time in one of those 45-degree angles from Pluto. The 0 conjunction, 45 semi-square, 90 first quarter square, etc. on your screen. But what you're noticing here is these are all specific 45-degree aspects with a little bit of orb. If Mars is a sextile or a trine, or one of the septiles or quintiles to Pluto, those are non-specific 45-degree aspects. And we can also have Mars-Pluto in a phasal relationship with no aspect at all. Mars will always, always have a relationship with Pluto, regardless of whether or not there's an aspect. There is no planet hanging out there in the chart all by itself. Every planet's in a phasal relationship one more time, regardless of whether or not there's an aspect. Now, one of the questions most of us go through is, do souls experience these lifetimes in a consecutive Mars-Pluto phasal relationship order relative to a specific natal Pluto house? Answer, who knows? I don't think anybody knows the answer. My guess Probably not. We can probably go back and forth and skip around with the signs. We don't wait 250 years to have Pluto in the same sign before we come back in another lifetime. I think we can move around and be learning in what we would almost call a holistic fashion, just depending upon each lifetime's experience for the soul and choices that it makes. Another little detail, in case somebody doesn't know that, if I'm remembering the EA teachings correctly, in general, about 10 to 20% of any lifetime will appear to be fated. And it's really choices we've made in a previous lifetime that sets up what appears to be a fated experience in the current life. Just like we will make choices in this life that will set up what appears to be a fated experience in the next life. I have a fixed house Pluto, 8th house Pluto. I am married to a 3rd house Pluto, and there are time periods where he wants to know why I'm so stubborn and why it takes me so long to change or make my mind up. Part of it is the fixed house natal Pluto, but it also is, as I started studying evolutionary astrology, I would many times in uncomfortable situations say, what is the best way forward to minimize the karma? What is the best way forward to minimize the karma? And I would just ask that question of the universe and ponder through that as I would wind my way forward. In other words, how do I release karma instead of creating it? Now, I do not mean to imply that my 3rd house partner is creating karma. He can just probably make his mind up faster than me. Sometimes, though, a 3rd house might, rush to a decision and then have to maybe come back and address it again. Same thing with cardinal, house Pluto's rushing forward, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Heard that one about the cardinal archetype. There's no right or wrong. It's just how we are operating. So here's a visual for you again, using Pluto here as that stationary 0-degree point for you. And I think this is the one I want. Yep. And so here's where we look at, if we make Pluto the 0 point, just right here, can be anywhere in the chart, but we start moving Mars in that counterclockwise fashion. We have the 0 primary lifetime, the 45, the 90, that if we have aspects in between with Mars, Pluto, or Mars is hanging out here at 20 degrees separated from Pluto, it's still a new phase relationship, secondary lifetime. So starting to get the visual example for everybody here. And now we're going to just kind of jump into our information. Oops, I should back up and tell you. Today, we're going to focus right here on this full phase, which is yang energy, which means energy moving out from the center. Energy that has to be expressing itself. And the key concept for full phase is meaning or completion. We've reached that halfway point from 0 to 180. We are in the fullness of the bloom, so to speak, if you want to look at it that way. We're not done blooming, okay? We still have about another 90 degrees of blooming here, from 90 to 270. All of this is part of the blooming, if you want to look at it from the perspective of plant life, and why this is more being able to really, build up the bloom. this might be where, as we move along, the flower's still blooming, but it starts to eventually fade a little bit until it starts going into last quarter and it reaches the decay, producing the seed to rebirth it. So, full phase from 180 to 225 degrees. There is the potential for it to be somewhat problematic to some degree for the soul, because the soul is equally divided between opposing forces. It wants all of the freedom. Think of the polarity, new phase. Ooh, I think I forgot to put that in again. I did that the first time. Hold on, everybody. I gotta make a note here so that I get it in the PDF for you. I thought about it this morning and then didn't get my note on paper. So that wanting to be completely free and independent, to do whatever I want with my instinctive desire to become, that's that polarity new phase. But then we are also wanting to actualize ourselves and our desires through the relationships of all the various levels and experiences that we can find them. And so this will actually create an inner opposition where we will fluctuate back and forth, just like gibbous phase leading up less than 180 degrees. This was also happening there as well. And as we go through these fluctuating cycles, we have that extreme of what we will call social immersion, that social butterfly, that wanting to be out there, compare and contrast, learn with everybody else through whatever those Pluto natal house desires are. But we will then also get thrown back in upon ourselves and go into the withdrawal or the isolation. Somebody else can do it better than us, or we're losing our sense of self. And so both of these cycles can create their own situations. When that Mars is full phase Pluto and we're just out there in the world expressing our desires back and forth with people, we can eventually become overwhelmed by the impact of everyone else's values, needs, and desires. Everyone else has a Mars Pluto in their chart as well. It can feel like we've lost some of our own essence. And when this happens, it starts to lead us into that isolation, and we flip over to that other cycle of the social withdrawal. And when we go into that cycle and we just go inward and we get stuck there because it's comfortable, we can lose perspective of who we are because we need that feedback from the universe to let us know, yes, this Mars Pluto expression of your desire nature is working in the world with others one-on-one or with groups or with societies, or it's not working. We can't have either extreme. So when we're in that social withdrawal extreme, eventually we start to get confused. And if we're too isolated, the universe brings the world to us. The universe finds some event or circumstance that moves us back out into the world. And what we really need to learn then as we start to go through this full phase is to be able to balance both sides of the social immersion and the need to be alone. And so as we go back and forth and back and forth, we gain that experience of how to actualize and express our desires out there in the world. And we learn how to evolve our own individual purpose relative to the desired nature of that natal Pluto. So we've got to honor the instinct to withdraw and be alone. And we have to honor that instinct to socialize and be out there in the world. And it's actually the going back and forth and back and forth that brings in the balance of ourself with others, the 180-degree mark that's there. Now, with that polarity phase being the new phase, one of the things that will happen, it's going to be the same of what we've described here just now with this phase. We can have a loss of ourself, the new phase. Think back to when we looked at 0 to 45 from Mars to Pluto, and that, just intensity of self wanting all the freedom to express. Over here in that full phase, we can lose that. And so that's when we get the withdrawal side. And that opposite of the new phase, if we're too full of ourself, then we will find that the full phase will draw in others who are more powerful or more knowledgeable to help us through, to help us find that balance, however it is necessary. So, looking at the specifics of the opposition then, and I have a tendency, especially with outer planets, to use wider orbs because they move so slowly. Might not necessarily use as wide of an orb comparing Mercury to Mars, or, the moon to Venus, so to speak. But if I'm comparing an inner planet to the outer planets, I will use up to a 10-degree orb for the conjunction. So I'll go all the way up to almost 190 degrees with Mars and Pluto and look at it as the aspect itself. The primary lifetime would be Mars 180, 181, 2, 3, 184, 185. We'll see that with our example right here with one of our charts in that we are going to look at. And so when we're looking specifically then at this aspect in the 180s, all of that individual meaning of whatever that original desire nature was relative to that, again, natal Pluto house, okay? It now has to be given social meaning via Mars. Those desires have to be expressed and shared out there with other people. We are learning Mars, Pluto, creating, achieving, expressing our soul's desires. We're learning to be an equal with others. And we're learning to listen to whatever the feedback is from others. The good old compare and contrast that then allows us to evolve how we want to express ourself and our desires out there in the world. And coming off of the gibbous phase and that gibbous phase opposition, 172, 175, 178, we are also learning how to express our desires in a way that is helpful to others, in a way that is of service to others in some way or manner. Now, what can happen here with the nature of the opposition? There is the potential to have a confrontation of will, Pluto, Mars, and a clashing of desires, Mars, Pluto. So if we're feeling like our sense of personal identity is being lost, then we can feel like we're out of control. We're, at the forces of everybody else. And keep in mind, we've just been coming through 180 degrees of really trying to shape our own destiny with our desire nature. And so we can want to force ourselves onto others. We can resist expanding in our social awareness. We want to come from that perspective of ourself. And so we can then want to dominate, want to power over. It helps us feel a little secure. I am so comfortable with this desire nature of mine that I really want to continue to express it in my whole sense of self. And if we get to extremes of that, we can continue to incarnate with Mars, Pluto in this aspect until we start to learn how to do that back and forth of the phase that we spoke about. When to be in the world, when to withdraw, when to socialize with others, when to balance that expression of ourself as we're moving forward and learning more and more and more. And so what happens here is we have to learn how to link our purpose, our perspective of our desires with what is helpful to society. And so if we're trying to force ourselves out there too much, we will have others come at us with more force, with more power. They're wanting to express their needs and desires just as much as we are. So it really is, and specifically in this aspect, learning that balance between ourself and others in regards to our whole desire nature, Mars, Pluto. And now this aspect in general, most of this you can apply those cycle and phases again between any two planets. But this aspect will reflect the dual desire nature of our soul, and it will reflect it between the specifics of any two planets. And when it comes to Mars and Pluto, it will be specifically to our desires. And so can you now see how our personal will is up against the ultimate will, divine will, source? And so we're really then having to learn how to balance what we want with what source perceives to be highest and best for us. And so when we look at it from the perspective of the dual desire nature with Mars, Pluto, the separating desires, we are going to want to be right where we are, expressing our own will out there onto the world and having the world just acquiesce to however our natal Pluto house desires want to manifest via Mars. Chances are those are going to be those separating desires. Been there, done that in some way. And to move forward, to really move forward, interacting with other people, interacting with the world socially, and even interacting with our perception of source. That moving forward is going to be the evolution of our returning desires to deeply know source. However, it is going to be expressed in detail via that natal Pluto by sign house and consciously expressing it forward via Mars with its own sign and house. And so it happens that our volunteer is having the Mars-Pluto opposition by aspect. I think I forgot to give Leroy clues of who our volunteers are, so I think it's okay. Lindsay is our volunteer, Leroy, if you see her name on the board. While we're waiting for her, if we start here at Pluto, retrograde 2213 Virgo in the 11th house, Aquarius soul. You see, she was born in 68 here. We have that Uranus new phase. But we start with Pluto and we go 185 degrees in 29 minutes to get to Mars, hanging out just shy of 28 degrees Pisces in the 5th house. Now, environmental conditionings for you. This individual feels that she is back and forth, transitioning, third individuated to first spirituated, upper middle class family, dad military, then an architect. They would run into financial troubles from time to time because he was an overspender. Mom was a teacher, both college degrees. She also worked in admin with helping find homes for foster children. This volunteer's mom family, gambling, oops, spelled that wrong. They were directly in SRF with her mom's grandfather, Self-Realization Fellowship with Yogananda, for anyone who may not be familiar with that. Their dad left mom after 25 years for a old high school classmate. It really was quite disturbing for the family. And once that happened, our volunteer didn't have much of a relationship with her father after that, even living closely, even after she had her own children. There was no connection. And father's deceased. Mom is still alive. She lives in Florida with her current partner. They're both still working. This volunteer has one sister. She didn't say whether younger or older. They had sibling issues growing up, but sister got a health issue. They became close, and they are very close now in their world. Volunteer's been married 24 years, son 23, daughter 14. Daughter was unexpected. Husband really didn't want children. Who came along. Husband has had some drinking issues throughout time. There's been some infidelity, which has led to marriage counseling. At this point, they are trying to work through everything. In the history of this volunteer's life, she has had 2 experiences with sexual trauma. One was with a boss, and another was with a stranger that she met or actually offered a ride to, and it didn't turn out so good. Her current job is ending, and it's kind of catapulting her into moving forward into being an astrologer. And so let me just check in. Volunteer, did your volunteer make it on live?
I'm here.
Hi, thank you for showing up, honey.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. So let's just look at the fact, first of all, in grounding your Pluto. 11th house Pluto, Aquarius soul, with that new phase conjunction of Uranus to Pluto. So off the bat, that can tell us that there's perhaps some degree of past life karma within the soul that can be retriggered from time to time. We also know generically that 11th house Plutos or Aquarian souls have come here to liberate, to break free from a lot of consensus conditionings. And they will do that by many times. If they're not willing to individuate, they will experience the alienation of never feeling part of a group. Where's my tribe? Who can I fit in with? And so as they are trying to liberate and learn who they uniquely are, and then how to go over to that fifth house and express themselves, express their creativity, express their ability to love themselves. As we find Mars there in, again, 5 degrees past that opposition with Pluto, you, soul, can perhaps discern with me on an intuitive basis whether you feel this is primary lifetime, whether you feel that maybe Mars has moved into the second lifetime of this opposition to Pluto. But what can happen with this Mars signature with it in late Pisces, and you see how Mars is new phase to Chiron, everybody. So Chiron also has the opposition to Pluto, and Chiron has a very tight opposition to Uranus. Many of us who our students of evolutionary astrology can be born into this generation, subgeneration of Chiron oppositions to Uranus. There were buku ones, 40 of them, like, or 50 of them. I don't remember. I lose track of the count over many, many decades here, 3, 4 decades, I think it was. So, the trauma and woundedness within our souls start to become very specifically drawn into this chart. When we look at it specific to that Mars desire nature, and Mars being in that sensitive sign of Pisces, balsamic archetype to its own rulership of Aries, I really see where there can still be this back and forthness between that fifth house Leo, desire to be me and express myself and be acknowledged in the world. And then still, though, that Mars in Pisces, I'm too vulnerable, or it's too much, or somebody doesn't accept or acknowledge me for who I am, 11th house Pluto. And it's like, oh, I think my Mars Pisces is just going to crawl back into my cocoon for a little while. So, relative to Mars by that sign and house, I feel that it just is almost amplifying the aspects that it is making to Pluto. Now, let me just stop at this point and say, feedback volunteer, I know you have been making some, I know you've been studying evolutionary astrology, so we would like to hear from you and your input and how you feel you've experienced this Mars Pluto.
Oh, I have to say, when you said that you gave a wide orb for exact aspect, I it blew my mind, because this whole time I've been studying, and I feel, I think as a new student, it's been a couple years of really concentrated studying, that sometimes I tend to take things for exactly as they are, and my mercurial mind just goes, no, that's the facts. Jeffrey Wolf Green said it had to be this aspect or it's not primary, but I so resonate with primary. I'm like, how can this not be a primary life? How can this not? Like the road and the path that I've been on, and everything that you talked about prior to me coming on has been exactly how I have lived out my Mars opposition to Uranus. Starting at a very young age, I just knew I was different, and I knew that I was in a family that did not reflect how I felt on the inside. And I thought, God, do I look like my parents? Am I really from my parents? Am I a biological child? Because I just didn't fit their ideal of a child either. And that got me placed in therapy when I was a really young age, because my mom just said, I didn't know what to do with you. It was just too much. She's like, I'm physically taller than my mom I've got her about like 6 inches. I'm 6 foot tall. And I have a very dominant personality. I have a lot of masculine traits. When I started becoming a teenager, I just kind of leaned on my parents. Like, this is not how I do it. This is not how I see things. I don't understand how you don't see it my way. So I spent a lot of time not integrating, really just more being obstinate and standing my ground and not trying to see the other side. And that really didn't serve me in relationships until I was much older. And even with my husband, it really took many, many years of us kind of coming together, feuding, and then retreating. And
Mm.
we are both, we almost have a very similar chart in that the house system is the same, and we seem to go through transits at the same time, which is really sometimes very conducive, and other times it really doesn't really light a fire under us to get going or start facing things. So I truly believe that the universe pushed me forward and created situations so that I would have to start looking at myself and try to find the balance instead of always saying, you know what, I'm just going to take my toys and go home. If you don't want to play that way, fine. I don't need you either.
Yeah,
So
gotcha.
learning to
Well,
play, to play well with others is kind of like the joke I use as I got older. It seems like that moniker from kindergarten kind of stayed with me. Like I need to learn how to share my toys. I need to learn how to work with others.
sure.
It's.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, as we can see here, you were also born just shy of a full moon. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you have quite a few gibbous and full oppositions in your chart with various planets, and sometimes it's hard not to bring in the Venus square the nodes as well.
Yeah.
You know, if you start to bring in, you know, the south node and its resolution node for Venus square the nodes, okay, there I can see how the past life trauma within the soul that you are trying to rebel, throw off, make conscious and throw off. But this will then also add to this picture and say that there has possibly been so much conditioning factors about how to be in relationships and who to be in relationships, you know, taking on all this karma chameleon, both Libra and that 12th house Pisces energy. And so that is part of this picture of how, again, you just got to burst out and express yourself. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I still see you then having quite a bit of a strong retreat back in.
Oh yeah.
You know, that Mars, this Mars Chiron signature, it's out and in, it's out and in, and it's doing exactly what this aspect tells you to do. And then over time, it's allowing you, and you know this, and so born in 68, you're in your early 50s, right?
Correct.
Yeah, I can't always do math when I'm interpreting. Um, so as you know, this, I've got to be me. I've got to be different. I've just got to be able to find an inner peace with myself being different. All right. And then expressing it out here over time. This Mars in Pisces could perhaps become more and more and more intuitive to where in your familial history, in your younger years, the explosions between myself and others, okay, and the intensity of those traumatic experiences repeated, you know, with the sexual trauma. Over time, those intensities have become softer waves because you're starting to balance that energy between myself and others. And what becomes to your benefit is Mars late Pisces starts getting those intuitive hits of, oh, this is what I want, this is how I want to express myself, and this is the manner in which I can be me, fifth house, and accepted in public, Pisces. And also, I think that whole I will, my will, divine will that we
Mm-hmm.
look at, you know,
Mm-hmm.
you've over time have, really had to go, okay, source, what are you teaching me here? How am I to do this differently? And then it allows me to actually have that fuller expression of myself than what I perceived, how I perceived I needed to do it. Make sense?
Makes sense completely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Because there, I would venture to guess that there's possibly been lifetimes in which it's suppress who I really am in order to get along or survive in groups of people, and lifetimes where I can't do this anymore, and literally having to break free regardless of that isolation. And so you could have had long experiences and maybe lifetime this way, lifetime that way, maybe mixed up within the lifetimes, but I say it in the term long experiences of either that enmeshment and that isolation. And so that's looking at these different archetypes in your chart that we are seeing here. The social acknowledgement, the social persecution. And what Mars Pluto is really bringing to a head is how to balance and adjust yourself with others in like almost every area of your life, every personal relationship you have, family you were born into, the family you create, friendships, coworkers, etc., etc. Every single relationship you have with Mars in an opposition aspect to Pluto, full phase, is relationship, relationship, relationship. Now, the Pluto Virgo is bringing in that flavor of I can't just Mars willfully force myself out there onto others with what I want anymore. How do I discover? How do I figure out the way to do it in which my desires will be accepted by others? Make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does.
Mm-hmm.
Cooperation seems to be a word that comes to mind for me.
Yeah. Huh. How do I cooperate with?
Cooperate. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. With
It's just not a party of one.
right.
I'm better together.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. And it also, I would say, is giving you a fair amount of experience in what you walk through and what you've been walking through up to this point of recent lifetimes. It's giving you the experience in relationships to then have know how to share that knowledge and experience with others who are still learning. So, for instance, in the world of astrology, your own path is showing you then how to help others in relationships via that language of astrology. Make sense?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Now, something that I want to say here that has been in some of Jeffrey's teachings, and um, it's not always an absolute. Sometimes it's experienced, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's karmic retribution, sometimes it's evolutionary necessity. But when it is specific to Mars and Pluto being in that you know, let's say 165 to 195 span. Mars, that opposition to Pluto, building or releasing, there can sometimes be violence of some sort. And of course, you will look to the specifics of the houses and signs to get clues for what that might be. Relative to Mars and Pluto having, co-rulership, Mars, that instinctive sexual desire, nature, survival of the species. And then Pluto, that merging with another karma mate, soulmate. Mars Pluto oppositions, and in general, even Mars Pluto aspects in various ways, but Mars Pluto oppositions, there can be a tendency to see the violence that will happen in some way. It's not always relative to sexual. Obviously, yours has had some of that experience. So I'm just really adding the caveats. So you're not hearing this as an absolute. Give you an example. I have a nephew who has Mars in a gibbous opposition to Pluto, and it's tight within a few degrees. He's had a commercial driver's license. It just seems to be one of the ways he knows he's not a desk job person. He's in his early 30s. And so in various ways, he's been a truck driver, and he was in the oil fields that bottomed out, tried driving more locally. But for him, the violence was coming home from a delivery, an hour drive back to our city, and high winds. He didn't have anything in the back of the vehicle, and he was driving slow, and the wind literally came over and flipped him on his side. And it just scared the hell out of him. He didn't get hurt in any way. It kind of totaled the vehicle, or
Wow.
the rig.
Hmm.
But it was violence for him. And in less than, I think, a month or so, he got a different job, because he said, I'm not going to do that again. And so that Mars Pluto, and in this, half 180, applying, separating, it really can work to jog the consciousness. That I will, my will, divine will. And he just basically said, and he's a sixth house Pluto with that Mars in the 12th. He just said, Source spoke to me, Kim, and said, get off the road. So I listened. So I'm sharing that example generically, so that you see that, yes, there can be the violence there. And he's a Pluto Scorpio with that Mars and Taurus. So he's, married, divorced. So he hasn't had sexual violence. He hasn't perpetrated it, but he has had the infidelity with an ex-partner and trauma drama around that. But for him, that biggest violence was just a trucking accident. So there's a variety of ways in which it can come out, and the whole intent and the whole purpose is soul waking us up. Oh, I don't exist in isolation. I have to come out into the world and learn how to be and operate with others. And so, with your chart and being an 11th house Pluto, another one of the archetypes we can look at, and especially as we're moving into that individuated and even spirituated states of consciousness, we get that we're different. We get that we're supposed to break free from consensus and individualize. We can sometimes get a little too comfortable in isolation, 11th house. And so when that's the case, the universe is going to bring relationships at us, the 180, Mars to Pluto. And then with Mars there in your 5th house, it really has to jog you further, expanding socially, full phase. Geez, who am I really? And what do I really want in my life? And how do I really want to relate out there with the world? That makes sense, volunteer?
Yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
It does. And I have to say, I think that part of the violence aspect, I think a lot of it, I have a lot of it unconsciously stored.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the more I study the conjunction with Pluto and Uranus conjunction and thinking about, ways in which to work with these things and these memories or imprints, um, I've started to really explore different tools and practices because I feel like there's a lot there stuffed down,
Yeah.
and it's like driving the wheel. It's got the control of the wheel, and
Mm-hmm.
just like I want to pull that back and not be so. I'll say all day long how, like, I'm not going to make my decision based on fear, and I say the right things, and I'm the Venus in Capricorn. I got this. I got my what together.
Mm-hmm.
But I go to bed at night and I'm screaming, and I'm like, why am I screaming? What is going on at night? What am I
Mm-hmm.
processing? And I dig deep,
Mm-hmm.
and I do have I have violent dreams. There's
Mm-hmm.
violence in my dreams a lot of times.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah.
So
Yeah.
working
You're
on that.
you're gonna want to. You were exactly right in finding multiple kinds of therapeutic releases,
Yeah.
and it goes just beyond the good old, let's have sex, okay?
Right.
Because your Mars signature, Mars in Pisces can be unconscious anger. When we have planets in Pisces or the 12th house, it can be so deep, and
Yeah.
we can go, where did that come from? Because while in the broader perspectives, Neptune Pisces 12th house is surrender to source, it's surrendering to higher power. Relative to the patriarchal distortions, it's also wrongfully imprisoned or entrapped or
Hmm.
enslaved, and that good old rage collapse that is just on that grand journey of teaching us to be more conscious with source, and more how we co-create in the universe. But we all on that journey from consensus individuating and spirituating over many lifetimes carry within our soul experiences that aren't easy or pleasant. And so you've got there can be layers of unconscious rage at the trauma, whether regardless of which side of it you've been on. And chances are some of both,
Well,
you
exactly.
the victim
Yeah.
and the victor. And so, yes, being able to express that out in healthy ways into the world and into consciousness is really helping to evolve the whole Mars Pluto desire nature, so that you can, because Pluto in the 11th, and to some degree Pluto in all the fixed houses, all right, but Pluto in the 11th, I would call them always having to make a mountain out of a molehill. I've had several 11th house Pluto girlfriends. And back in the heyday before Leroy and I were together, and up through the first few years, I had a part-time assistant who was an 11th house Pluto. Leave me all these messages with hair on fire, and by the time I get back to call her back because I'm traveling on the road, oh, I figured it out, no big deal. And so I finally learned with these 11th house Plutos, that energy, that fixed air has such a buildup
Yes.
that it has to have a physical release with this Mars Pluto opposition specific to you. It has to have a mental and a verbal release. So the therapies for you are not just, somatic with body and emotions. They also have to be therapies that allow you to express your voice, whether that is screaming in rage, whether that is breath work, whether that is tuning, when
Hmm.
we, sing in those types of ways. Um, that's all the various ways of how this Mars energy wants to express everything that has been so suppressed below the surface with the natal Pluto and Uranus signature. So
Oh, I'm definitely feeling that.
on the right
Well,
track, and that will
Mar
probably, your own, the student becomes the teacher, etc.
yeah, I was just saying I'm having my Mars return too today or yesterday.
Yeah, Leroy has his Mars at 23, 24 degrees Pisces, and we were just looking earlier how he had the Mars return, and he's getting ready to have Neptune over his Mars next year. I don't know whether you get it 3 or 5 times, Leroy. So, so really feeling maybe a little sensitized to. How do I be myself? And how do I play in that sandbox, as you yourself said?
Yep.
hmm So, questions, comments for me, or volunteer? Do you have any? Anybody else who's out there listening? Questions, comments that you want to ask or share? We're not doing complete chart interpretations today, but willing to answer questions in any area. We're trying to do just a real strong focus on Mars Pluto here. All right. Well, I just had my kitty come sit on my lap, and he was just reminding me he was born with Mars square Pluto first quarter, just degrees past that square. I have a birth date for my 2-year-old Taurus sun cat. First time I've ever had a birth chart, you know, an accurate date for a cat, because I always get strays. And this one actually came from the Humane Society. And he was adopted out, didn't get along with who adopted him. He was returned back in. And, that Mars square Pluto, he, he is so. He's a little traumatized kitty walking around, and 2 years with us now. We're watching him. No, 2 years, year and a half, baby. He was half a year when we got him. We're watching him slowly come out of his shell and really be able to do that Mars first quarter to Pluto and express himself.
Can we have a
So,
question on the board if
mhm,
you want to take it?
sure.
I was really interested in listening to our volunteer with that new phase, uh, you know, Pluto Uranus, which we see a
Mhm,
lot in evolutionary
mhm,
astrology. It's a powerful symbol. But what
mhm.
about the retrograde? This student or associate wants to know about, does that retrograde flavor this opposition, this full phase relationship?
Sure. Well, first of all, to have both of these planets retrograde, this soul is not going to be able to suppress the trauma. When you have those outer planets retrograde, they're really trying to throw off, the 3 outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. They have that broad general rulership of the unconsciousness. And when those 3 planets are retrograde, they're trying to make the unconscious conscious. And when you see planets in the 11th house, and there can you know, if for those of you who remember Jeffrey Green's book on Uranus, that is 30 years old, still highly recommend it. Um, you know, Uranus, Aquarius, 11th house, the avant-garde moving us forward, the Saturnian coming off of Capricorn, some say old Saturn, old ruler of Aquarius 11th, you know, wanting to so totally defend the past or suppress the the unconsciousness, and then of course those in the middle going back and forth between moving forward, defending the past. So you have all three of those archetypes when you're looking at Uranus, Aquarius, and 11th house. And so when we look at an Aquarius Pluto in the 11th, all three of those are operating with Pluto retrograde. This is going to be a soul who cannot suppress the unconscious, who cannot suppress the traumas of that 11th house. And then you have Uranus new phase that, and Uranus is retrograde. The same thing is going on. The spontaneous memories that come up into consciousness, the spontaneous flashbacks, whether from early childhood, and mother was I think I forgot to put that in there, mother was somewhat physically abusive to this volunteer, not to mention also emotionally and verbally abusive as well. And so just those traumatic situations that would trigger the past life memories and the confusion that could come from all of that. And so in general, these two retrograde planets are not going to be able to suppress the trauma. They're going to remember it. They're going to re-experience it. The potential with Uranus new phase Pluto is to break free from re-imprinting it. There will be certain degrees of which it can be re-imprinted, but the intent of the soul, Uranus new phase Pluto, and in the 11th, is to break free from the traumatic patterns, to be able to objectify and create new patterning mentally, that then will be followed through emotionally, Pluto the soul, and that will then be followed through with experiences. So this is another way in which the Mars and the Chiron oppositions, Pisces fifth going, yes, I've experienced that. Yes, this is within my soul's history. However, I do not have to let that be the experience of who I am, fifth house. And I do not let that have to be the experience of me continuing to be a victim, the distortions of Pisces. Especially if the soul is individuating, spirituating consciousness and really starting to open up deeper relationship with source, I can have broader and broader understandings of this, and then have new and different expressions of this in relationships with people as I move through my life. So, recap, that retrograde is really throwing off the past. It's throwing off the trauma, and it is pointing towards the polarity point of Pluto, which means it's also pointing towards this Mars opposition and the Chiron here. So back to what we originally said, with this soul so feeling like this could be such a primary lifetime in which there is a total rebirthing of how soul is in relationship to others, and how soul is expressing all the creativity within it out there into the world. Soul or volunteer, would you agree? I think Leroy might have muted you. Maybe Leroy could unmute with this question.
I'm back.
Mm.
Yes, I agree. There was one part though that was not, I don't think, maybe I misspoke about the relationship, or there was no abuse.
Mhm.
I never had any kind of violence or abuse. The
I thought
only
you
abuse,
said that mom was emotionally and verbally
mm-mm.
abusive, yelling. What
Oh
did?
no, me. I was the
Oh.
yeller. I was the yeller. Yeah, no, it was
Oh,
me. It was
I
not
gotta get it
her.
out.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Okay,
the most of the abuse for
gotcha.
me was, it was sexual in nature. That was the violence I experienced growing up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Yeah,
Gotcha. Yep. Yep. Thank you for clarifying that then.
sure.
And good question, because that allowed us to really go in and address those two retrograde planets and how they're in so many ways catapulting you forward, learning Virgo, and really how to balance yourself and others in that expression of your own desires and creativeness out there in the world in more healthy and equal ways. All right. Thank you very much, volunteer. Leroy, you can interrupt me if we have any other questions. I'm not paying attention to time here. As we move through the full phase, then we get to the harmonics of 7. And here we have the triseptile aspect, which is just shy of 206 degrees. And as we are starting to move off of the opposition aspect, we start to get to the point here. If you will remember, septiles have that sense of special destiny, or that a sense of fatedness that starts to come into the picture. And so here it will show us ways in which our desired nature is learning how to really be out there in partnership and cooperation with social groups, and how we can express our desires, but do them in a way that is socially productive. We're really starting to become aware of how we don't operate in total isolation. We're always in, relationship to something else and someone else. And so what can happen here is there can be key people, key circumstances that will just come forth, that will really help us have an expression of those natal Pluto desires in a socially acceptable way via Mars. And this kind of came up when I was teaching my Cycle of Phases and Aspects workshop a week or so ago, and that sometimes there are some of those minor aspects, and they start to just kind of blend into other aspects. Because, for instance, if we look at this 206 degrees, the next aspect, we go from 180 to 206. And yes, there can be some quintiles in there. I don't remember for sure, but probably. But then our next aspect that comes along is the 210-degree inconjunct, the full phase or outer inconjunct. And so one of the examples that I explicitly used was a soul that had, I don't remember the planets because we use all kinds of planetary pairs, but the aspect was 208 degrees. And so we said, yeah, this is secondary, not even secondary. I'm talking Mars, Pluto. The phase of relationships with these two planets are moving from that triseptile to that inconjunct. And so when some of those minor aspects are a little close, there can feel like it's a little of each. And it's, it's just like when you're, starting to open the door, but the door's not far enough open for you to walk through it. The door's not closed anymore, but the door's not open. You kind of feel both ways. You can sense both ways. We can have that in some of these aspects. Specific to Mars Pluto, then, when we move into the outer inconjunct, I want to just reflect back that in the gibbous phase, the waxing 150-degree inconjunct, that was more of inner adjustments. Yin phase, gibbous, drawing us inward to see how we internalize and analyze what it is we must change inwardly with ourselves. The full phase inconjunct, yang phase, this then becomes outer adjustments. This is where people and situations are coming at us or interacting with us, causing us to adjust ourselves some way societally. We're having to make the adjustments and analyzations outside of ourself interacting. And so, whatever our new socialized evolutionary intent of those natal Pluto desires are, they are adjusted out there in the world. And especially as the individual in question is realizing what it can and cannot do. So we want to socialize in all kinds of ways, but there's only so much way we can socialize relative to the Mars Pluto desires. And then again, we will get outer confrontations with others whenever there is some adjustment to our desires that have to continue to take place in order to meet a societal need or be socially accepted. So there's limits of how what we can do with our individual desire nature, and there's limits to what our desires, how our desires can be accepted out there in the world. It is helping us recognize, oh, I don't get to just, do that fullness of expression with my desires out there in every which way or manner. I am now having to learn how to be socially accepted with my desires and what I can do. And if we're not willing to make these adjustments or changes on how our desires are relating in the world in some way, then we will experience the social or collective humility and purification. And so this is something, for most of you, going beyond beginning astrology, it's so important to know between any two planets. Is it a waxing gibbous inconjunct, or is it a waning full inconjunct? Those are two different aspects. And if you are familiar with the yod configuration in a chart, we always will have two planets in a sextile, and then those two planets make inconjuncts to a third. You've got to break it down between faster and slower moving planets on whether the sextile is waxing or waning, and you then have to break down the inconjuncts into whether they're waxing or waning. There can be one of each. There can be two waxing inconjuncts. There can be two waning inconjuncts. And that's really how you can get to the full depth of interpreting a yod aspect versus traditional astrology, that just says, well, there's an awkward relationship and both planets are having to adjust to the apex of the yod. No, that's just a glossing over in simplification that is ignoring the cycle of phases and aspects. And so we have our second chart volunteer. I'm going to take a drink of water before I move on. And so here we're going to look at a chart example where the Mars-Pluto angle is 211.25 degrees. This one's 1966. So both of our chart examples are Uranus new phase Pluto. Isn't that interesting? And both chart examples have Uranus and Pluto retrograde. So what we had said before in general, Uranus new phase Pluto, the having unconscious traumas coming up to the surface and wanting to break free. Uranus new phase Pluto still all there. And of course, we're also dealing with the Pluto Virgo generation, and you can see just exactly how tight this Uranus new phase Pluto is, all 3 minutes. Can't get much tighter than it, exact. But if we would start with Pluto here, we will go counterclockwise through the signs and the houses, and we will go 211 degrees before we get to Mars over here at about 18 degrees Aries in the 8th house. Now, this volunteer put herself down as kind of moving through second stage individuated, and because I've known her for a while, and we've looked at her chart before in various classes, and I'm looking at the specific Mars Pluto aspect, and I'm going, I don't know if I would put this chart volunteer second stage. I actually think maybe you're a little more expanded in consciousness than this volunteer. I think it might be that Mars Pluto and Mars Uranus aspect that creates a lot of frustration for you that might make you think you're in the rebellion of second stage. You can rebut me if you'd like. Briefly, Christian background, one-time molestation from dad when he was about 13. A year after that, he had a heart attack. I don't know if father passed at that time, but after the heart attack, the family ended up from lower middle class to lower class. Oh, maybe this was the chart where mom was somewhat physically abusive and alcohol. Oh yes, this is it. I got my environmental conditionings mixed up between my two volunteers. This is where I saw it. As this volunteer got to be about 7, 8 years old for Saturn Square, mom would become verbally, emotionally abusive, especially after alcohol, which was almost every weekend. Only child, she left home early. She eventually ended the relationship with mother. She was a military vet. First husband just disappeared, and the marriage was dissolved after a certain period of time. She is now married, housewife, no kids. Once she became debt free, including paying off her house, then she stopped working, and she spent a lot of time in the world of astrology, for which many of us are very, very grateful. Volunteer, are you there? Leroy. Oh, I didn't tell Leroy who my volunteer was. Her name is Wanda Leroy. All right. Checking
Huh?
in with. I hear you. Hi, honey. Thank you for volunteering.
Oh, you're much, much, much welcome.
Hey, Let's start out with the second stage individuated, okay?
Oh,
Would you
hmm.
agree with me that it's possible relative to this Mars aspect to your Pluto and you being an Aries soul, Pluto in the first house, you having Uranus 3 minutes new phase Pluto, they're both retrograde. Your Mars is in Aries in the Pluto house. Can you see how just starting off the bat that aspect can have you feeling rebellious, especially with society?
Oh, definitely. Though it wasn't reflected that much as a child. Um, the rebelliousness really didn't come until I hit my late 30s. Prior to that, I really was the um, go along to get along, tried to keep my head low,
Mm-hmm.
to keep folks from getting, upset with me. It seems like I couldn't do anything right, so I just,
Mm-hmm.
tried to become the wallflower. So yeah, I guess that's probably why I put that because I feel like I'm a baby as far as that, um,
Mm-hmm.
rebellious stage.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, gotcha. So we'll move into Mars Pluto. So let's just look at this a little bit then. I'm going to add a few things into the chart here. When you have, I say this in general, when Neptune is conjunct on the other planets, one of the first things you can look for is confusion. And I speak from experience because my Neptune is a half a degree. My Mercury is a half a degree balsamic Neptune, and my Sun is 1 degree balsamic Neptune. And my joke
Mhm.
is I was a natural space cadet. I didn't learn how to speak up, have a voice, all the way through childhood. So sometimes when we have a strong Neptune in the chart, I mean, it can be like we're almost invisible.
Mhm. Yes.
And you have these 3 planets, Pisces, 7th house, that add to that picture. And in your situation, the South Node is balsamic Neptune. Okay, we start with the planet, we reverse through the signs and the houses. South Node's balsamic Neptune, and in Scorpio, that retrograde is there to help us out. But there can just be that it took you a while to find your voice. All right.
Mhm.
And sometimes when you have that Neptune conjunct that South Node, of course, we have the relive, the fruition, and the mixture of the two. But just recognize how for you, Neptune would create emotional confusion, that South Node. And then you have these planets over here in Pisces in the 7th house, and wide oppositions to this Pluto Uranus. And so if you came through a familial environment and you know whenever there's an only child, the child can be just overly indulged. We can also have situations for an only child when there's 2 parents, when it's 2 against 1. And so, your mom, physically abusive when you were younger, emotionally, verbally abusive when you were older. If both your mom and dad were the loudest voices in the room, you know, that early conditioning to this Mars Pluto had you go, excuse my French, I better shut the fuck up and disappear or it's gonna be really bad.
Yeah.
And that could have been your early, sensing. And it could have even been, almost pre-verbal in some ways with that Neptune conjunct the South Node. So it's been just a gradual unfolding to really learn how to express the limits of yourself in relationships with others. So does that make sense, volunteer?
Yes, yes. It pretty much the way I interpret it and experience it is I've really had to stand up for myself and
Mm-hmm.
say, no, you're not going to treat me this way. And you
Mm-hmm.
and if you insist on acting in that manner, then this relationship is over.
Yes. So this is a very good chart example for those listening live or in the future, because if you're coming off some of the just the generic of what we looked at in the last PowerPoint slide, and how if the will Mars of the soul, Pluto, is just trying to really force itself out there in society, the outer inconjunct society will come back at it. But we can have that opposite. And this can be mitigated then as well by the fact that we have the Pluto in Virgo generation. So I have Pluto 2 degrees Virgo. One of the things that I have come to recognize and teach over the years is, you know, everything that was in Pluto Volume 1 is accurate, but there is also that overboard with the toning side of Virgo. You know, that the victimization part, that I, you know, deserve the hurt, I deserve the whatever. Sometimes that Virgo energy gets so into the service of other broadly, you know, that it forgets to serve self. And so one of the things that I started to put in my notes as the years went by is the Mercury side of Virgo 6 has to learn how to better serve itself as well as another and society and source. And so this is, for me, a great example for you, because let's back up then and look at a Pluto Virgo generation in the first house. We look at first house Pluto's Aries souls, you know, me, myself, and I got to have all this freedom. I got to exert myself out there. And you could generically look at this chart and go, whoa, this person is just out there all over the place, probably running over everybody. But this is not the environmental conditioning. And this is why the observe, correlate is so important. The other thing that we can have, another part of the first house spectrum is, you know, remember there's the superhuman complex, but there's also the inferiority complex that comes with the first house Pluto. And on that side, we crawl in. I want to be alone. And so we can blend this Pluto and Pluto Virgo generation in this first house, okay? And this soul could be spending a lifetime birthing themselves beyond the physical birth. Now birthing themselves in the world, birthing themselves mentally, to think for themselves, Uranus, new phase, Pluto, rebelling against any patriarchal distortions of the Virgo archetype, that, you know, I've got to hide, I can't be me, you know, that Piscean sensitivity of others, and I express I'm going to get hurt. And so as time has went by, as we look at this aspect, okay, the outer adjustments here is the soul desire to be me, to rebirth myself, to find out who I am, unique to me, Uranus, Pluto, to have these experience of myself. To me, I see the outer inconjunct, the 200 degrees. This soul has been learning how to express her will out there in society. This is me. This is who I am. This is how I am going to be. This is what I am going to do. So it's almost like this soul is again birthing her will in society to stand up to society as an equal, full phase, when that Mars in the 8th perhaps has come through, others over, extending their will, domination, full phase upon her. Would you agree, volunteer?
Yes.
Further comments?
Um, I wish that I would have made note of it. I was really kind of a beginner in astrology, so I didn't even think to do it. But I remember this pretty well, and I think it was another thing that just further catapulted me, saying that either you have to stand up for yourself or you may end up, almost end up dying,
Mm-hmm.
contracting something and dying. I
Mm-hmm.
had some pain in my breast for a while. And I remember it went on for a good probably 6 or 7 months, if not a little bit longer. And I remember one night, at this point I was still in relationship with my mother, and this was right before her behavior started to getting worse. Um, in the middle of the night, it felt like something was burning and almost like a stabbing kind of pain right in that spot where I was having the pain
Mm-hmm.
in my breast.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, I mean, I was in a, dead sleep, that, um, I guess you would call it that REM sleep, that good dreaming sleep. Because I can't remember what I was dreaming, but I know I was dreaming.
Mm-hmm.
And the pain was so sharp and burning, it woke me completely up out of my sleep, and then it just disappeared. And right after that, I stopped having that pain in that area, and I felt like that was that wake up call to, like, look, something's getting ready to come up, and you are going to have to start standing up to your mother and her family, because
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, you know you're going to get your freedom, but it's probably going to take you 6 feet under, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in
Yeah,
order
yeah,
to do it.
yeah.
And I said, nope, I ain't going out that way.
Mm. Mm. That's in while I can see it this way, I'll explain it. Neptune rules the immune system overall, and Neptune will rule the energetic or spiritual origin of whatever imbalance manifests into the physical. I'm someone gonna sidetrack just a little bit because the I always I don't know, I must known this for lifetimes, but I came in going, well, behind every physical imbalance is an emotional imbalance.
Mhm.
wounds to the, our emotions. And behind the emotional imbalance is a mental imbalance, wounded mental patterns and thoughts. And behind the mental imbalance is a spiritual imbalance, a disconnect from source in some way. And so when we have what's called miraculous healings, we go to the core, we go to the spiritual energetic origin, we go to source. We have some type of, reconnection with source, light bulb that goes off. And that then manifests down mentally and changes the thought process or attitude, which then condenses down emotionally, which heals, quote unquote, distorted or negative emotions to more positive, which then has the physical imbalance release and dissolve. And that's that energy in which we create all diseases and in which we heal all diseases, spiritual, mental, emotional, physical, in that order. And so many of us know in the world of astrology that Neptune's the closest astrological archetype we have to source, to God, Goddess, Be Kahuna, Great Spirit. And so with this Neptune conjunct the South Node there, and it the Scorpio, death, rebirth. Okay. So you had deep, deep connection with source that went on there. Deep messaging from source. It woke you up.
Literally.
And look at the recognition you had, spiritual, mental, emotional, physical. And it was, you have to step up into your power and express your will with others. So it's not all, so this is a real good example here, in that we can't always look at that outer inconjunct as another person or society coming at us and holding us down. As we're moving through full phase, 45 degrees of learning how to be in equal relationships. Doesn't mean we always get it right at 182 degrees.
Right.
We can have that crisis point at 210. And in this example, expressing our will and standing up and saying, if I don't be me in the face of others, I will lose my life force. Makes sense for everybody? Volunteer? Makes sense?
Most, most definitely. And
Yeah,
I'm pretty
good.
sure Uranus was probably, I'm guessing it was maybe near the Chiron, because it was after I had turned 42. So it was in the seventh. It hadn't gone
Mhm,
um,
mhm,
into Aries yet.
mhm, mhm. Oh yeah. Well, that could, as you can see, you can take your example you showed us, and we can come up with multiple, planetary aspects natally and forecasting planets to the natal chart to see it.
Yeah. But I mean, even
However,
still,
go ahead.
I
Go ahead.
still didn't. I started moving in that direction, and I don't know. Maybe it's because of the Mars in Aries, in aspect with the first house Pluto. I
Mhm,
did the cardinal. I moved a little forward, and then I
mhm,
backed up.
mhm,
You
mhm,
know,
mhm,
because that happened probably, oh, probably say 2009 or so. Let's
mhm,
see. No, it was earlier than that. It had to be. Yeah, it was earlier than that. So it was probably say 2007, somewhere around in there, 2008, early 2008.
mhm,
And as you can see, it took another, what, 6 years, 7 years
mhm.
before I said, okay, I'm done.
With the relationship with mom, just
Yeah,
clarifying for
right.
everybody.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you can see how Uranus is moving within orb to be activating that aspect of Sun to Pluto Uranus. And then eventually Uranus over that Mars aspect. So you can see where there might be more of this adjustment of how do I stand in my authentic power and life force and express myself out there in society.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Let me bring in and see if anybody else listening has questions or comments in what we just gave as example. And while we're waiting to see if there's anything from anybody else, I, I'll say something in general for the fire archetype, okay, which is spirit. You know, we so many times hear that, you know, the Leo fifth house is just so full of self. And I'm saying, wait a minute, observe, correlate. Sometimes we have planets in fifth or Leo because they need to learn how to have an expression of self. We might see that example with your moon volunteer. It's Leo, but it's 12th house. But and we hear with the Sag archetype how, you know, when it's not standing in its truth, it's compromising on itself. The Aries archetype, we have a tendency to think it's always that willfulness and superhuman, but we can have the inferiority side of Aries, that underdeveloped freedom of ourself. And so, with all three of the fire element archetypes, signs, and houses, don't always assume that there's overexpression, that energy of fire and spirit. It can be there. Sometimes they have those archetypes to develop it, to build it. And this can be some of what is really, again, birthing out of you this lifetime volunteer.
Yes, I think so. It's a slow process, and I still get it took me a long time to really kind of understand what you meant about the two steps forward, one step back, and moving
Mhm,
forward, getting scared, and then retreating. And
mhm,
boy, have I been I really got it in the last few months with some of the projects that I'm doing. Sometimes I'm feeling okay to put it out there, and then once it's time to get on the stage, and I'm like, what the heck was I thinking that I'm going to do this? And I had one of my very, very good friends uh, basically just had to just kind of metaphorically kick me out of the nest, because I was just getting ready to go on and do a presentation, and right before I was getting ready to go on, because he texted me and said, okay, are you ready? I'm ready to get set up and all that. And about 10 minutes before it was time, I was like, I can't do this. I literally texted him, was like, I can't do this. He
mhm.
texted me back and like, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? And I was like, no, no, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. No, 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 I shouldn't be doing. And he was like, no, you're going to. So
Yeah.
he talked me into it, and presentation went well. And I still go through that, right before it's time to go on. It's like my heart is about to thump out of my chest. It's like,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
wonder, can that be heard, over the microphone? And I'm like, should you be doing this? Should you be doing this? Nah, you shouldn't be doing this. You're not good enough to do this.
Yeah,
What
yeah,
makes you think you can do this?
yeah, yeah. So that is when the universe, or I was going to say somebody who has knowledge of your chart, going, we're going to kick you out of the nest here, outer in conjunct Mars to Pluto. That's society coming at you and pushing you forward in the world.
Yes. And most of the folks that are in our little circle, um, they are really pretty much the reason that I am, out, kind of out in the, doing what I'm doing now, because they're like, come on, you can do this, you can do this, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing this. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
who are you talking about? And they're like, you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, yeah, I've definitely been experiencing that kicking out of the nest, because every time I get ready to, you know, retreat back in the, and work behind the scenes, which is what I really prefer.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like being out there in the open.
Mm-hmm.
They're like, no, no. And they'll call
Yep.
me out. It's like, no. So yes,
Well,
definitely kicking out of the nest. Hmm. Hmm.
congratulations. There's society going, okay, babe.
But I'm still not comfortable with it. I'm wondering, when is it ever, am I ever going to get to a point where I'm comfortable with it? You
Well,
know?
for the Pluto Virgos, it's not about it's in general, the past is security, the future is insecure because it's unknown. And so it's never in general about moving forward once you're secure, it's moving forward through the insecurity. And that gets specific to the Pluto Virgo generation.
Hmm.
And so it's practice, 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 practice. And so that Mars in Aries, and even drawing in that Sun in Aries, making the waning in conjunct to Uranus and Pluto, the practice is try, 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 initiate, initiate, initiate. So it's literally experience that moves us past. And it doesn't mean you ever will get through, butterflies. I mean, as many years as I've been doing this, I just did 2 4.5 hour, online workshops, and I still got the same thing going on. So it's
Hmm.
not that completely eliminating it. And especially Pluto Virgos, it's how do I walk through it regardless? Hmm.
So it's the stopping in front of the, because what it really feels like, it's like you're walking out in public naked,
Yeah, oh yeah. Hmm.
like you're buck naked.
Uh-huh. Totally. Totally, totally.
So just make sure you got a mirror at the door, and stop and look in the mirror before you go out. The metaphorical mirror.
Right. Well, thank you, Volunteer. I appreciate you letting us look at your chart and giving us such an interesting, such a beautiful example that you can't, again, no assumptions with archetypes. Observe, correlate. And so I better move on. I've got to get us through a couple more aspects. These are only going to take a couple of minutes, everybody. You've all hung in there. Oh my gosh, I already went 2 hours. Sorry, I didn't pay attention to time. As we then move beyond that 210, and we're making whatever our adjustments to our desire nature is in society, we come to the harmonics of 5, the biquintile. Septiles are special destiny, fatedness. Quintiles are creativity. And so here, whatever that socialized purpose is of our desire nature, it starts to become more and more refined, and we start to recognize where we have special talents with our desires, special creativity with our desires. In other words, it's like a mini blossoming of creativity with our whole desire nature, and we can be aware of this and we still continue to compare ourselves and our desires to others, but we also then have others start to notice us. So this is a mini blossoming on our way to that 240-degree last quarter trine. Now, finally, in this phase, we come up against the less than 225 degrees with the harmonics of 8, the full phase sesquisquadrate. And so energy is still yang here, but the closer Mars Pluto gets to 225 degrees, the more we feel the frustration of that shift into disseminating yin phase. And so one more time, here is where all of the egocentric consciousness of our own soul expressing its desires has to make adjustments with society. We have to really start to take into consideration what the, existing social customs, laws, etc. are out there in the world, in which we must know them, understand them, to be able to have that natal Pluto, soul's desires expressed out there via Mars. So this is a transition with this aspect to be able to fully integrate our personal desires into a socialized context that is relating to and fulfilling societal needs, as well as our own personal desires. And so whenever you see Mars to Pluto as just shy of a 45-degree mark, and those are going to be the semi-sextiles and the sesquisquadrates, in addition to squares, opposition, you will pay. Let me say it two different ways. First of all, when you see Mars Pluto shy of the 45-degree mark with moving into the semi-squares and the sesquisquadrates, you're going to have the yang energy moving to yin. And so that energy wants to do yang, and it's feeling this yin, yin, yin that's coming on. Let me see if I got this right. In other words, you really want to pay attention when you're looking at Mars, Pluto at one of the evolutionary gates, the 45-degree marks. Is it yang moving to yin? Is it yin moving to yang phase? And this is going to be when it's less than the 45-degree mark. And you kind of want to pay attention to this, because it really adds a flavor of building up pressure and building up frustration between Mars and Pluto, and that ability of being able to literally express ourselves. And so, again, less than 45 degrees with semi-squares, sesquisquadrates, the yang energy moving to yin. Make sense? You guys, I'll let you reflect back on looking at the cycle of phases and aspects. And so thank you to our volunteers. Thank you to everyone participating today. We're going to have a class next July, or next month, in which we'll look at Mars, Pluto, and disseminating phase. As you can see, we have 3 phases yet to go here. I will take the month of August off. And then here's public classes. My nodal axis is still up there because it's more recent. It just did the free Mercury retrograde in Cancer yesterday. A lot going on in June and July, everybody. Between the solar eclipses, Venus finishing up retrograde, Mercury retrograde in Cancer, then Mercury and Sun making oppositions to the 2020 stellium. It's not really going to quiet down. Details, go see Mercury retrograde. You can find it on our website. And then I set the date tentatively for the Mars retrograde cycle in Aries. And of course, then you see we're going to have another Mercury retrograde just before the US election. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for those who attend live, those of you who follow up afterwards. Everyone, be safe, be well, enjoy summer, and thank you for helping us move planet Earth forward in so many different ways socially. We're just beginning to see Jupiter and Saturn and then Pluto move into Aquarius, and I'm starting to have hope. All right, everyone. Adios. I will see you next month.